A bad idea, Professor Lockhart, said Snape, gliding over like a large, malevolent bat. Longbottom causes devastation with the simplest spells. We'll be sending what's left of Finch Feltry up to the hospital wing in a matchbox. Neville's round pink face went pinker. How about Malfoy and Potter? Said Snape with a twisted smile. Oh, excellent idea, said Lockhart, gesturing to Harry and Malfoy into the middle of the hall as the crowd backed away to give them room. Now, Harry, said Lockhart, when Draco points his wand, what do you do this? He raised his own wand and attempted a complicated sort of wiggling action and dropped it. Snape smirked as Lockhart quickly picked it up, saying, Whoops! My wand was a little over excited. Snape moved closer to Malfoy and bent down and whispered something in his ear. Malfoy smirked too. Harry looked up nervously at Lockhart and said, Professor, could you show me that blocking thing again? Scared, muttered Malfoy, so that Lockhart couldn't hear him. You wish, said Harry, out of the corner of his mouth. Lockhart cuffed Harry merrily on the shoulder. Just do what I did, Harry. What, drop my wand? But Lockhart wasn't listening. 3, 2, 1, go, he shouted. Malfoy raised his wand and quickly bellowed, Serpensatia! The end of his wand exploded, and Harry watched aghast as a long black snake shot out of it, fell heavily on the floor between them, and raised itself ready to strike. There were screams as the crowd backed away, swiftly away, clearing the floor. Don't move, Potter, said Snape lazily, clearly enjoying the sight of Harry standing motionless eye to eye with an angry snake. I'll get rid of it. Allow me, shouted Lockhart. He brandished his wand at the snake, and there was a loud bang. The snake, instead of vanishing, flew 10 feet into the air and fell back on the floor with a loud smack. Enraged and hissing furiously, it slithered straight towards Justin Finch and Feltry and raised itself again, fangs exposed, poised to strike. Harry wasn't sure what made him do it. He wasn't even aware he decided to do it. All he knew was that his legs were carrying him forward through what he was casters that he had shouted stupidly at the snake. Leave him alone. And miraculously and inexplicably, the snake slumped to the floor, docile as a thick black garden hose. Its eyes now on Harry, Harry felt a fear drain out of him. He knew the snake wouldn't attack anyone now, though he couldn't possibly have explained it. He looked up at Justin, grinning expectantly to see Justin looking relieved or puzzled or even grateful, but certainly not angry and scared. What do you think you're playing at? He shouted, and before Harry could say anything, Justin had turned and stormed out of the hall. Snape stepped forward and waved his wand, and the snake vanished in a small puff of black smoke. Snape, too, was looking at Harry in an unexpected way. It was a shrewd and calculating look, and Harry didn't like it. He was also dimly aware of the ominous muttering all around the walls, but he felt a tugging at the back of his robes. Come on, said Ron, his voice in his ear. Move, come on. Ron steered him out of the hall, Hermione hurrying alongside them. As they went through the doors, the people on either side drew away as though they were frightened of catching something. Harry didn't have a clue what was going on, and neither Ron nor Hermione explained anything until they dragged him all the way up to the Gryffindor Tower common room. Ron pushed Harry into an armchair and said, You're a Parselmouth? Why didn't you tell us? I'm a what? Said Harry. A Parselmouth, said Ron. You can talk to snakes? Yeah, I know, said Harry. I mean, that's only the second time I've done it. I accidentally set a boa constrictor on my cousin Dudley at the zoo once. Long story. But it was telling me he had never seen Brazil, and I sort of set it free without meaning to. That was before I knew I was a wizard. A boa constrictor told you had never been seen Brazil? Ron repeated faintly. So, said Harry, I bet loads of people can do it. Oh, no, they can't, said Ron. It is very uncommon gift, Harry. This is bad. What's bad? Said Harry, sitting up feeling quite angry. What's wrong with everyone? Listen, I just told the snake not to attack Justin. Oh, that's what you said, was it, to it? What do you mean? You were there. You heard me. I heard you speaking parcel tongue, said Ron. Snake language. You could have been saying anything. No wonder Justin panicked. You sounded like you were egging the snake on or something. It was creepy, you know. Harry gaped at him. I spoke a different language? But I didn't realize. How can I speak a language without knowing I can speak it? Ron shook his head. Both he and Hermione were looking as though someone had died. Harry couldn't see why it was so terrible. Do you want to tell me what's wrong with stopping a massive snake biting off Justin's head? He said. What does it matter how I did it, as long as Justin didn't have to join the headless hunt? It matters, said Hermione, speaking at last in a hushed voice, because being able to talk to snakes is what Salazar Slytherin was famous for. That's why the symbol of the Slytherin house is a serpent. Harry's mouth fell open. Exactly, said Ron. And now the whole school's going to think you're the greatest great 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 grandson or something. But I'm not, said Harry with a panic. He couldn't quite explain. You'll find that hard to prove, said Hermione. He lived about 1,000 years ago. For all we know, you could be. Harry lay awake for hours that night. Through the gap of the curtains around the four-poster bed, he watched the snow starting to drift past the tower window and wondered, could he be a descendant of Salazar Slytherin? He didn't know anything about the father's family. After all, the Dursleys had always forbidden questions about his wizarding relatives. Quietly, Harry tried to say something in Parseltongue. The words wouldn't come. It seemed it had to be face to face with the snake to do it. But I'm in Gryffindor, Harry thought. The Sorting Hat wouldn't have put me here if I was a Slytherin blood. Ah, said the nasty little voice in his brain. But the Sorting Hat wanted to put you in Slytherin. Don't you remember? Harry turned over. He'd just seen he'd seen Justin the next day in herbology, and he'd explained what he'd been calling the snake off, not engaging it on, which he thought, angrily pummeling his pillow, any fool should have realized. By the next morning, however, the snow had begun in the night and had turned it into a blizzard so thick that the last day of her biology lesson and term was cancelled. Professor Sprout wanted to fit socks and scarves on the mandrakes, a tricky operation that would entrust her to no one but else. Now, it was important that the mandrakes grow quickly and revive Mrs. Norris and Colin Creevey. Harry fretted all about this the next day to the fire of the Gryffindor common room, while Ron and Hermione used their time off to play a game of wizard chess. For heaven's sake, Harry, said Hermione, exasperated, as one of Ron's bishops wrestled her knight off the horse and dragged him off the board. Go and find Justin if it's so important to you. So Harry got up and left through the portrait hole, wondering where Justin might be. The castle was darker than it usually was at daytime because of the thick, swelling gray snow at every window. Shivering, Harry walked through the classroom. There were lessons to be taking place, catching snatches of what was happening within. Professor McGonagall was shouting at someone who, by the sound of it, had turned his friend into a badger. Resisting the urge to take a look, Harry walked down by, thinking that Justin might be using his free time to catch up on some work. He decided to check in the library first. A group of Hufflepuffs, who should have been in herbology, were indeed sitting at the back table in the library, but they didn't seem to be working. Between the long lines of high bookshelves, Harry could see their heads were close together, and they were looking absorbed in the conversation. He couldn't see whether Justin was among them. He was walking toward them when someone of what they were saying met his ears, and paused to listen. in the hidden invisibility section. So anyway, a stout boy was saying, I told Justin to hide up in the dormitory. I mean to say, if Potter's marked him, now he's the next victim. It's best if he keeps his low profile for a while. Of course, Justin's been waiting for something like this to happen ever since he's let slip to Potter he was muggle-born. Justin actually told him he'd been down from Eton, but that's not the kind of thing you bandy about with Slytherin air on the loose, is it? You definitely think Potter is? Does that think it is Potter? Then Ernie, a girl said with blonde big tails anxiously. Hannah, said the boy solemnly. He's a Parselmouth. Everyone knows that the mark of the Dark Wizard. Have you ever heard a decent one who could talk to snakes? They call Slytherin himself Serpent Tongue. There was some heavy murmuring in this, and Ernie went on. Remember what was written on the wall? Enemies of the air, beware. Potter has some sort of run-in with Filch. Next thing we know, Filch's cat is attacked. The first year, Colin Creevey was annoying Potter at the Quidditch match, taking pictures of him while he was lying in the mud. Next thing you know, Creevey's been attacked. He always seems to be so nice, though, said Hannah, uncertainly. And, well, he's the one who made you know who disappear. He can't be all bad, can he? Ernie lowered his voice mysteriously. The Hufflepuffs bent closer, so Harry edged near so he could catch Ernie's words. No one knows how he survived the attack by you know who. I mean to say, he was only a baby when it happened, so he should have been blasted to smithereens. Only a really powerful dark wizard could have survived a curse like that. He dropped his voice until he could barely hear more than a whisper. That's probably why you know who wanted to kill him in the first place. Didn't want another Dark Lord competing with him. I wonder what other powers Potter's been hiding. Harry couldn't take it any more, clearing his throat loudly. He stepped forward in front of them on the bookshelves. If he hadn't been feeling so angry, he would have found a slight greeting him funny. Everyone in the Hufflepuff looked at him as though they were petrified by the sight of him, and the color was draining from Ernie's face. Hello, said Harry. I'm looking for Justin Finch Floutery. The Hufflepuff's worst fear had clearly been confirmed. They all looked fearfully at Ernie. What do you want with him? Said Ernie in a quivering voice. I wanted to tell him what really happened with the snake and the dueling club, said Harry. Ernie bit his white lip, taking a breath, and said, We were all there. We saw what happened. Then you noticed that after I spoke to it, the snake backed off, said Harry. Well, all I saw, Ernie stubbornly through his trembling spoke, was speaking parcel tongue and chasing the snake towards Justin. I didn't chase it at him, Harry said, his voice shaking with anger. It didn't even touch him. It was very near miss, said Ernie. And in case you're getting ideas, he added hastily, I might tell you that you can trace my family back through 9 generations of witches and warlocks. My blood is as pure as anyone else. I don't care what sort of blood you have, Harry said fiercely. Why would I want to attack Muggleborns? Have you heard? I heard you hate the Muggles you live with, said Ernie swiftly. It's not possible to live with the Dursleys and not hate them, said Harry. I'd like to see you try it. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the library, earning himself a reproving glare at Madame Prince, who was polishing the gilded cover of a large spell book. Harry blundered up the corridor, barely noticing where he was going, and then he saw in such a fury the result was that he walked into the something very large and solid, which knocked him backward onto the floor. Oh, hello, Hagrid, Harry said, looking up. Hagrid's face was entirely hidden by his woolly snow-covered balaclava, but he couldn't possibly be anyone else. He filled up most of the corridor in his moleskin overcoat. A dead rooster was hanging from his massive gloved hands. Aye, Harry, he said, pulling out the balaclava where he could speak. Why aren't you in class? Cancelled, said Harry, getting up. What are you doing in here? Hagrid held up a limp rooster. "Second one killed this term," he explained. "It's either Fawkes's or a blood-sucking bugbear, and I need the headmaster's permission to put a charm around the coop." He peered more closely at Harry from under his thick snow-flickered eyes. "You sure you're all right? You look like you're all hot and bothered." Harry couldn't bring himself to repeat what Ernie and the rest of the Hufflepuffs had been saying about him. "Oh, it's nothing," said Harry. "I better be going, Hagrid. It's Transfiguration next, and I've got to pick up my books." He walked off, his mind still full of what Ernie had said about him. Justin's been waiting for something like this to happen, ever since he let it slip. Potter was Muggle-born. Harry stamped up the stairs and turning another corridor. He was particularly dark. The torches were extinguished by a strong icy draught that was blowing through the loose window pane. He was halfway down the passageway when he tripped heading over something laying on the floor. He turned to squint and he had fallen over. He felt as though his stomach had distorted. Justin Finch Feltry was lying on the floor, rigid and cold, a look of shock on his face, his eyes clearly staring blankly at the ceiling. And that wasn't all. Next to him was another figure, a strange sight Harry had ever seen. It was nearly Headless Nick, no longer pearly white and transparent, but black and smoky, floating, immobile, and horizontal, 6 inches to the floor. His head was half off, and his face wore an expression of shock, identical to Justin's. Harry got to his feet, breathing fast and shallow, his heart doing a kind of drum roll against his ribs. He looked wildly up, down, and down the deserted and saw a line of spiders scuttling fast as they could away from the bodies. The only sounds were muffled voices of teachers in the classes on either side. He could run, and no one would never know he had been there, but he couldn't just leave them there, lying there. He had to get help. Would anyone believe that he had anything to do with this? As he stood there, panicking, the door next to him opened with a bang. Peeves the poltergeist came shouting out. "Why is wee Potter?" cackled Peeves, knocking Harry's glasses askew as he bounced past him. "What's Potter up to? Why's Potter lurking?" Peeves stopped halfway through the mid-air somersault upside down and spotted Justin and nearly Headless Nick. He flipped right away, and his lungs before Harry could stop him. He screamed, "Attack! Attack! Another attack! No mortal or ghost is safe! Run for your lives! Attack!" Crash, 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 the doors flew open in the corridor, and people flooded out. For several long minutes there was a scene of such confusion that Justin was in danger of being squashed by people just keep standing on nearly Headless Nick. Harry found himself pinned against the wall as the teacher shouted, "Quiet!" Professor McGonagall came running, followed by her own, with her wand, set off a loud bang, which restored silence and ordered everyone back to their classes. No sooner had the scene been cleared somewhat than Ernie Hufflepuff arrived, panting at the scene. "Caught in the act!" Ernie yelled, his face stock white, pointing his fingers dramatically at Harry. "That'll do, Macmillan," said Professor McGonagall sharply. Peeves was bobbling overhead, and now grinning wickedly, surveying the scene. Peeves always loved chaos. As the teachers bent over Justin and nearly had the snake examining him, Peeves broke into a song. "Oh, Potter, you rotter! Oh, what have you done? You're killing off students. You think it's good fun." "That's enough, Peeves," barked Professor McGonagall, and Peeves zoomed away, backward, and his tongue out of sticking his tongue out at Harry. Justin was carried to the hospital wing by Professor Flitwick and Professor Sinistra, the astronomy department, but nobody seemed to know what to do with nearly Headless Nick. In the end, Professor McGonagall conjured up a large fan out of thin air, which gave him to Ernie with the instructions to waft nearly Headless Nick up the stairs. This Ernie did by fanning Nick along with the silent black hovercraft. This left Harry and Professor McGonagall alone. "This way, Potter," she said. "Professor," said Harry at once, "I swear I didn't." "This is out of my hands, Potter," said Professor McGonagall curtly. They marched to silence around the corner and they stopped before a large, extremely huge stone gargoyle. "Let me drop," she said. This was evidently a password of some sort, because the gargoyle sprang open immediately, hopped aside as the wall behind them split in two. Even full of dread for what was coming, Harry couldn't fail to be amazed. Behind the wall was a spiral staircase that was moving smoothly upward like an escalator. As he and Professor McGonagall stepped into it, Harry heard the wall thud close behind him. Those rose upward in circles higher and higher and higher, until at last, slightly dizzy, Harry saw the gleaming oak door ahead, with the brass knocker and the shape of a griffin. He knew that he had been taken to, must be, Dumbledore, where Dumbledore lived.